In July of 1944, while Allied troops were still fighting their way across Normandy, 730 delegates from 44 nations checked into a resort hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire to decide something almost nobody back home was paying attention to. Cruise currency would run the world once the war was finally over. For 3 weeks, in stifling summer heat, with no air conditioning, and rooms so oversold that some delegates slept in bathtubs, 2 men, 1 British and 1 American, fought over the answer. The American won. And when the delegates went home, the dollar had become the only currency on Earth, backed directly by gold, with every other currency on the planet pegged to it. This is the story of how a hotel in the woods quietly decided the financial architecture of the next 80 years. Most people who've heard of Bretton Woods know it created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, 2 institutions that still shape global finance today. What almost nobody realizes is that the conference was really a proxy fight between a dying empire and a rising one, fought out through the driest possible language of exchange rates and reserve currencies, and that the outcome was largely decided before the delegates even arrived. To understand why this meeting mattered so much, you have to understand what the interwar years had just taught the world about currency chaos. The 1920s and 1930s had been a monetary disaster. Nations abandoned the gold standard at different times and in different ways, competitively devalued their currencies to gain trade advantages, and threw up tariff walls in response. A beggar thy neighbor spiral that deepened the Great Depression, and, many economists argued, helped drag the world into a second global war. Victory began to look inevitable by 1944. Planners on both sides of the Atlantic understood that whatever monetary system replaced the old one needed to prevent that chaos from ever happening again. It was who would design it, and in whose interest. Britain sent its most formidable economic mind to make its case. John Maynard Keynes, already a legendary figure for his earlier writings, warning that the punishing reparations imposed on Germany after the First World War would destroy the peace, arrived at Bretton Woods, still representing an empire that, on paper, remained one of the great powers of the world. Keynes proposed something genuinely radical, a new global reserve currency called the Bancor, which no single nation would control, managed by an international clearing union that would automatically penalize countries running large trade surpluses just as much as those running deficits. It was an elegant, ambitious idea designed explicitly to prevent any one nation, including the country that was about to become the world's dominant economic power, from accumulating outsized control over the international monetary system. The problem for Keynes was that Britain, despite its historic prestige, had spent itself into near total dependence on the United States. By 1944, British debts to Washington had ballooned across 5 years of war, and Britain's gold and dollar reserves were a shadow of what they had been a decade earlier. Keynes arrived at Bretton Woods, representing an empire that could no longer back its own arguments with financial weight, and everyone in the room, including Keynes himself, understood this. Standing opposite him was Harry Dexter White, senior official at the United States Treasury, and the chief architect of the American negotiating position. White had no interest in Keynes's Bancor proposal, and for good reason. The United States held roughly 2/3 of the world's monetary gold reserves by the end of an almost unimaginable concentration of financial power built up as European nations shipped their gold across the Atlantic to pay for American war material throughout the conflict. White's plan was far simpler than Keynes's and far more advantageous to Washington. The US dollar would be pegged directly to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other country's currency would then be pegged to the dollar, not to gold directly. In effect, the dollar itself would become the world's reserve asset, the intermediary, that every other currency measured itself against. The negotiations that followed were less a debate between equals than a slow, exhausting demonstration of exactly how much leverage American gold reserves actually carried. White was polite to Keynes in public, deferential even, given Keynes's towering reputation. But he did not meaningfully bend on the substance. Session after session, the American position held, not because the American arguments were more persuasive on their economic merits, but because Britain simply did not have the financial standing left to insist otherwise. By the time the conference closed on July 22nd, had walked in wanting. The banker was dead, The dollar was king. The consequences of that outcome unfolded over the following decades in ways the delegates in that overheated hotel could not have fully anticipated. Every central bank on Earth now needed to hold dollars as reserves, giving the United States what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing would later famously call an exorbitant privilege: the ability to run trade deficits and finance them simply by printing more of the currency. The rest of the world was obligated to hold. American consumers could buy foreign goods with dollars that foreign central banks would then park right back into American Treasury bonds, an arrangement that effectively let the United States borrow from the rest of the world on uniquely favorable terms for decades to come. By 1971, the United States had printed and spent so many more dollars than its actual gold reserves could support that President Nixon was forced to formally sever the dollar's convertibility into gold altogether. Event so significant it deserves its own telling, but even after gold convertibility ended, the underlying architecture decided at Bretton Woods. The dollar as the world's default reserve currency survived the collapse of the very gold peg it had originally been built around. Nations kept holding dollars out of habit, infrastructure, and the sheer absence of any credible alternative. A testament to how durable the choices made in that New Hampshire hotel really turned out to be. It's worth being fair to both sides here. Keynes was not simply an idealist tilting at windmills. The post-war world to American dollars. Both men were serious economists trying to prevent a repeat of the monetary chaos that had helped produce 2 world wars in a single generation. But the system that emerged reflected, quite transparently, the balance of financial power that existed in the summer of 1944. And once that architecture was in place, even after the specific conditions that justified it had long since disappeared. Seat. End quote. If this kind of deep dive into the hidden financial history behind the headlines is what you come here for, consider subscribing to The Discount Window.